What kind of school builds a cemetery on its own campus? Not a memorial added years later by people trying to honor the past. Not a plaque placed on a wall after the building closed. An actual working cemetery, dug into the ground while the school was still operating, filled with children who arrived alive and never made it home. That question sounds simple. It almost sounds too simple. But when you begin following the answer, it leads somewhere that most standard history books never go. And that gap, the space between what happened and what most people were taught, is itself worth examining. In 1879, a school opened in the state of Pennsylvania. It was built on the grounds of a former military barracks, a location that had previously housed soldiers, not students. The school was called the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. It was funded directly by the federal government of the United States. It was designed specifically for children, Native American children, in particular, brought from reservations and tribal lands spread across the country. And within its first few decades of operation, that school had a cemetery on its grounds. Children were buried there. The graves were real. The records, at least some of them, still exist. Most people who completed 12 years of American public education have never heard the name Carlisle. That is not a small detail. It is an institution that operated for decades, that was funded by federal money, that processed thousands of children, and that left behind documented graves. The absence of this story from standard history curricula is something that researchers and scholars have noted, and the absence itself raises a question. When something of this scale goes largely untaught, it is worth asking why. Not to assume an answer, but simply to notice that the silence exists. The building still stands today. The grounds are still there. The Army War College now occupies the campus where the school once operated. People walk those grounds regularly, but the history underneath them, the institutional history, the documented record of what happened there, is something most visitors would not immediately know. That detail is not dramatic. It is simply a fact. And facts like that one tend to pull at something when you sit with them long enough. To understand why this school exists in the historical record at all, it helps to go back to the period surrounding its founding. The late 1800s in the United States were a time of significant westward expansion. Native American communities held large territories across the continent. The relationship between the federal government and those communities had been shaped by decades of conflict, treaty-making, and treaty-breaking. By the 1870s, the government was looking for approaches that would be cheaper than ongoing military campaigns and more acceptable to the public. The idea of education as a tool of policy began to gain traction in certain government circles. Captain Richard Henry Pratt was a Civil War veteran who had previously overseen Native prisoners of war in Florida. He believed that Native Americans were intellectually capable of learning and adapting to American society. By the standards of his era, that belief was considered forward-thinking in certain circles. He argued that the solution to what government officials called the Indian problem was not warfare but assimilation. Education, he believed, could accomplish what military force had not. He pitched this idea to federal officials, received support, and opened Carlisle in November of 1879. The school became his model, and that model spread. At first, the framing seemed straightforward. A government official believed education was better than war. He opened a school. He wanted to bring Native children into mainstream American life. That is the surface-level explanation, and it is the one most commonly offered when the school is mentioned at all. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the methods used at Carlisle, and at the hundreds of schools that followed its model, do not fully match the stated goal of education. And that mismatch is where the questions begin to accumulate. Children who arrived at Carlisle had their hair cut immediately. Long hair held cultural and spiritual significance in many Native communities. It was not simply a style. Cutting it was understood, on both sides, as a form of erasure. The children's traditional clothing was taken from them and replaced with military-style uniforms. They were given new English names, sometimes chosen at random by school administrators. Some children pointed at a list of names on a blackboard and were told to pick one. That name would become their official identity for the duration of their time at the school, and sometimes for the rest of their lives. Speaking their own languages was forbidden. The languages these children had grown up speaking, the languages their parents and grandparents spoke, were not permitted inside the school. Children who were caught speaking their native languages faced physical punishment. The government's own 2024 investigation into the boarding school system described the methods used to cross these institutions using specific language. It called them systematic, militarized, and identity alteration methodologies. Those words did not come from critics or advocacy organizations. They came from the federal government reviewing its own historical record. That is a meaningful distinction. Luther Standing Bear was one of the children who arrived at Carlisle in 1879, the school's first year. He had traveled more than 1,500 miles from Pine Ridge. He later became an author, an actor, a Lakota chief, and one of the most significant voices for Native rights in the early 20th century. He wrote about his experience at Carlisle in his autobiography. He described what it felt like to stand in front of a blackboard covered in English names and to choose one. He described the experience as if he were touching an enemy. He chose the name Luther. From that point forward, the name his father had given him was no longer used inside the school. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A child who cannot use his own name is being told, systematically, that his identity before the school did not matter. The school's administration understood the visual power of that transformation. A commercial photographer named John Choate was hired by the Carlisle administration to document the children. He produced before and after portrait pairs. In the before photograph, the child would be shown in traditional clothing, with long hair, positioned to emphasize their difference from white American society. In the after photograph, taken months or years later, the same child would appear in Western clothing, with cropped hair, positioned differently. These photographs were sent to Washington officials, to potential donors, and to reservations across the country. They were recruiting tools. They were designed to show that the school's methods worked. The existence of a deliberate visual campaign to document cultural transformation raises its own questions about what the administration understood it was doing. But this is where it becomes unclear in a more specific way. If the goal was genuinely to prepare children for independent life in American society, certain things would logically follow. The children would have been taught skills that matched the actual opportunities available to them. Their health and well-being would have been a documented priority. The mortality rate inside the schools would have been low, or at least comparable to schools generally. The record does not show that. Luther Standing Bear wrote that most of the graves in Carlisle Cemetery belonged to little ones. He observed this himself. He was there. Carlisle alone buried at least 186 children between 1880 and 1918. Some of those graves held more than one child. When the Army relocated the cemetery in 1927, some remains were lost. Families have been searching for over a century. That number, 186 at one school, is documented, but the broader picture is larger and more uncertain. A 2024 investigation identified more than 3,100 student deaths across the entire boarding school system between 1828 and 1970. That figure is 3 times higher than what the government's own earlier investigation had reported. The Department of the Interior, in its own language, stated that the real toll was likely in the thousands or tens of thousands. Those words came from the federal government describing its own program, and even with that acknowledgement, the government noted that its count was still incomplete. The documentation exists in large volumes, but the full picture, the actual number, remains unclear. That is not a resolved question. It is an open one. Most Americans went through years of formal education without encountering any of this. The school operated. The graves were dug. The records were maintained, at least in part. And yet the story did not make it into standard curricula. Some researchers have pointed to this as a pattern rather than an oversight. When an institution of this scale, more than 400 schools across 37 states, funded with what amounts to $23.3 billion in today's money, does not appear in standard history education, that absence requires some kind of explanation. The explanation that it was simply forgotten does not hold up easily against the scale of what is documented. The government reviewed 103 million pages of its own records to produce its investigation report. That number gives some sense of how deep the paper trail runs. And yet families searching today for information about their ancestors are told that boarding school records are difficult or impossible to access. The religious institutions that operated roughly half of all the schools have not been required to open their archives. Whatever those records contain remains behind closed doors. The government reviewed 103 million pages and still said the count was incomplete. Those two facts sitting next to each other do not fully resolve. What this video is looking at is a documented institution, a real school, a real cemetery, a real federal program that operated for generations. The government has formally acknowledged it existed. A sitting president issued a formal apology for it in October 2024, 145 years after Carlisle opened. The apology came without a reparations framework and without a process for opening the remaining locked archives. More than 800 children are still in the ground at or near the schools where they were sent. The government has confirmed at least 74 burial sites at 65 different locations and expects to find more. This video does not claim to have a final answer. What it has is a documented record, one that the government itself produced, that contains details which do not fully line up with the official framing of the school system as an educational effort. The questions that come from examining that record are not invented. They come from the record itself. And those questions, once noticed, are difficult to set aside. What kind of school builds a cemetery? That question opened this video. It has not been fully answered yet, and perhaps that is the right place to begin. The official explanation for what happened to Carlisle, and at the hundreds of schools that followed its model, is not complicated. It is actually quite straightforward when presented in the way government officials and historians have traditionally framed it. In the late 1800s, the United States government believed that Native American populations needed to be brought into mainstream American society. The reasoning, as it was presented at the time, was that integration was the only viable path forward for indigenous communities in a rapidly changing country. Officials argued that education was a far more humane approach than the military conflicts that had defined the relationship between the government and Native nations for decades. That was the stated justification, and on the surface, it holds a certain internal logic. Captain Richard Henry Pratt is the figure most associated with this policy. He was a Civil War veteran who had spent years in military service before turning his attention to what he considered a social problem. Before founding Carlisle, he had overseen Native prisoners of war in Florida. During that time, he ran informal educational programs for the prisoners and became convinced that Native Americans were entirely capable of learning, adapting, and participating in American civic life. That belief, in the context of the 1870s, was not as common as it might sound. Many officials and public figures of the era held openly dismissive views about the intellectual capacities of Native people. Pratt's position that they were equals was, by the standards of his time, considered a relatively progressive one. Pratt took that belief and built a program around it. His core argument was that the solution to the ongoing conflict between the United States government and Native nations was not military force, but cultural transformation. He believed that if Native children were educated in English, trained in Western trades, dressed in Western clothing, and given Western names, they would be prepared to enter American society as equals. He called this assimilation. He presented it as a form of rescue, and he was persuasive enough in making that case that federal officials gave him the resources to test it. In November of 1879, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School opened on the grounds of a former military barracks in Pennsylvania. It was the first federally funded boarding school designed specifically for Native American children. The practical curriculum at Carlisle was built around what were called industrial skills. Boys were taught trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, shoemaking, and farming. Girls were taught domestic skills including cooking, sewing, and housekeeping. English language instruction was central to everything. Children who arrived speaking their native languages were expected to learn English as quickly as possible. The school also placed significant emphasis on appearance and behavior. Children wore uniforms. They followed a structured daily schedule. They attended chapel. The environment was organized deliberately to resemble, in many ways, a military institution rather than the conventional school. That resemblance is something worth noting, though its significance is something historians continue to interpret differently. The government's framing of all this was consistent and deliberate. These schools were presented to the public, to Congress, and to Native communities as opportunities. Officials described them as pathways into modern American life. The language used in government communications of the period frequently referred to the schools as acts of generosity, as gifts being extended to communities that would otherwise be left behind by the progress of American civilization. That framing was repeated often enough and consistently enough that it became the dominant public understanding of what the schools were doing. And for a time, that understanding went largely unchallenged in mainstream public discourse. Pratt's model at Carlisle was considered successful by the officials who funded it. Within a few years of opening, the school had attracted attention from Washington, from church organizations, and from the public. The Carlisle football team became nationally known. Students gave public performances. The school produced graduates who went on to work in various trades. All of this was used to support the argument that the assimilation model was working. And because the model appeared to be working, at least by certain measurements, it was expanded. Over the following decades, more than 400 similar institutions opened across 37 states. That is not a small number. It represents a nationwide system, built deliberately and funded consistently over many years. Congress played a direct role in building that system. Federal funding was allocated to establish and maintain the schools. The government did not simply permit these institutions to exist. It actively created them, funded them, and oversaw them through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This is an important distinction. The boarding school system was not a collection of private initiatives that happened to receive some government support. It was a federal program. The decisions made inside those schools, the curricula, the rules, the methods, were shaped by federal policy. That institutional connection matters when examining what the schools actually did and why. Churches also played a significant role. Religious organizations, including Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, and other denominations, partnered with the federal government to operate roughly half of all the schools in the system. The government provided funding. The churches provided administration, staff, and in many cases, the underlying philosophical framework. This partnership meant that the boarding school system was not solely a government project. It was a collaboration between federal institutions and religious ones. That partnership has become relevant in recent years because the private records held by those religious organizations have not been subject to the same disclosure requirements as federal records. Some of those archives remain closed today. What they contain is not fully known. By 1926, the system had grown to the point where approximately 83% of all school-aged Indigenous children in the United States were attending some form of government-supervised school. That figure comes from the historical record. It is a striking number. When more than 8 in 10 children from a particular population are inside a single institutional system, the word voluntary becomes difficult to apply in any straightforward way. The scale alone changes the nature of what is being described. A program that reaches 83% of an entire population's children is not a limited experiment or an optional opportunity. It is something closer to a total system. That is the accepted explanation. Taken at face value, it describes a government policy built on a stated belief in assimilation through education. It describes a founder who genuinely believed in the intellectual equality of Native Americans. It describes a program that expanded because officials considered it effective. And it describes a nationwide network of institutions that, by the 1920s, had reached the vast majority of Native children in the country. The explanation has an internal consistency. It fits together in a way that makes the policy sound, if not morally straightforward by today's standards, at least understandable as a product of its time. But this is where it becomes unclear, because a policy built genuinely around education and opportunity would be expected to produce certain things. It would be expected to produce graduates who were better positioned economically than they were before. It would be expected to strengthen communities over time. It would be expected to leave records showing that the welfare of the children was a central concern. And it would be expected to show some alignment between what the schools taught and what the children actually needed when they returned home. When the historical record is examined on those specific points, the alignment is not straightforward. The schools taught blacksmithing, sewing, and domestic labor, but the land that many Native families held, land that children would return to after leaving the school, required agricultural knowledge specific to particular regions and climates. The skills being taught and the conditions children would face when they left do not consistently match. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A school that prepares children for a life they will not actually live is not straightforwardly an educational institution. It raises a question about what the preparation was actually designed to accomplish. The framing of rescue also becomes complicated when examined against the documented experiences of the children inside the schools. If the schools were acts of generosity, the children inside them would be expected to describe them that way, at least in significant numbers. But the accounts that survive from students who attended Carlisle and similar institutions do not consistently reflect that framing. Luther Standing Bear, who attended Carlisle in 1879 and later wrote about his experience, described the school in terms that do not match the language of opportunity and rescue. He wrote about loss. He wrote about the graves of children who never went home. His account is not the only one of its kind, but the government's presentation of the schools during their operational years did not include voices like his. That absence from the official record is something worth sitting with. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult in a more specific way. The government framed these schools as educational institutions. The founder framed them as tools of rescue and equality. The churches framed them as missions of civilization and faith. All three framings pointed in the same direction. They all described the schools as being for the benefit of the children inside them. But when you look at who controlled the decisions inside those schools, who set the rules, who determined the curriculum, who decided whether a child could return home or stay, the answer in every case is the institution, not the family, not the community, and not the child. That concentration of control is not unusual for schools of that era, but it becomes more significant when the outcomes are examined. The official explanation presents the boarding school system as a policy shaped by the beliefs of its time. Some historians accept that framing and argue the schools should be understood within their historical context, not judged by standards that did not exist when they were operating. Others argue that the outcomes, the mortality, the land loss, the generational disruption, are not fully explained by good intentions or historical context. Both positions exist in the scholarly record. Neither has fully resolved the questions raised by the documented facts. And that unresolved space is where this investigation continues. What the accepted explanation does not fully address is the gap between what was stated and what is documented. The schools were described as educational. The methods used inside them were described as necessary for assimilation. The outcomes were described as progress. But the children who did not come home were not progress. The graves on school campuses were not outcomes that fit neatly inside the language of rescue and opportunity. And the records, where they exist, tell a story that does not fully match the official one. That mismatch does not have a simple explanation. It simply exists in the record, and it is enough to keep the questions open. The first problem with the official explanation appears almost immediately. It does not require deep research to find it. It appears when you take the stated goal of the boarding school system and hold it directly against what the documented record shows actually happened inside those institutions. The stated goal was education. The stated goal was integration. The stated goal was to prepare Native American children for participation in modern American life. If those were genuinely the objectives, then certain things would follow as a natural consequence. The methods used would reflect those objectives. The experiences of the children inside the schools would align with them, and the outcomes, measured honestly, would point in the same direction as the stated intentions. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the documented methods do not consistently match the stated goals, and that gap is specific enough to examine carefully. Start with something basic. If the purpose of a school is to educate children and prepare them for independent life, the first step would logically be to understand what those children already know. Every functional education system builds on a foundation. A child who already speaks a language, who already has a cultural framework, who already understands relationships and community and responsibility within their own context, is not starting from nothing. They are starting from somewhere. A genuine educational approach would recognize that starting point and build from it. That is how learning works. That is how it has always worked. But the boarding school system did not begin there. It began somewhere else entirely. Children as young as 4 years old were removed from their homes and sent to institutions hundreds or sometimes thousands of miles away. 4 years old. At that age, a child has just begun to understand the world around them. They know the faces of their family. They know the sounds of their language. They know the rhythms of their community. That is the foundation they had. And the first thing the boarding school system did, systematically and deliberately, was remove them from it. Not gradually, not gently. Removed. The separation was immediate and in many cases total. Some children did not see their families again for years. Some never returned home at all. The question of consent is one that the historical record does not fully resolve. Some families were told their children would receive an education and willingly sent them, hoping it would provide opportunities in a changing world. That is documented, but it is also documented that in many cases, children were taken without meaningful parental consent. Agents working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs visited reservations and tribal communities with quotas to fill. Families who refused sometimes faced consequences, including the withholding of food rations that communities depended on. Whether a decision made under those conditions can be called willing participation is something historians continue to debate. The answer is not straightforward. Upon arrival at the schools, the first experiences the children had were not educational in any conventional sense. The first experiences were physical and immediate. Hair was cut. In many Native communities, hair held deep cultural and spiritual significance. It was not simply a personal style. Its cutting carried meaning that went well beyond appearance. The children understood this. Their families understood this. And the school administrators understood it too, which is part of what makes the decision to cut it immediately upon arrival a detail worth examining. If the goal was simply to prepare children for a new environment, the timing and the deliberateness of this particular act requires some explanation. Traditional clothing was taken and replaced. Military-style uniforms were issued in its place. The choice of military uniforms rather than ordinary school clothing is itself a detail that does not fit neatly inside an educational framing. Schools typically dress children in clothing appropriate for learning. The deliberate use of military-style dress suggests something closer to institutional conditioning than academic preparation. The visual effect was total and immediate. A child who arrived in traditional clothing and left the intake process in a uniform, with cut hair and a new name, would be nearly unrecognizable within hours of arriving. That transformation was not incidental. It was the point. The new names are a particularly specific detail. Children were given English names to replace the names their families had given them. In some cases, children were handed a list and told to choose. In other cases, names were simply assigned by administrators. Luther Standing Bear, who arrived at Carlisle in 1879, described pointing at a blackboard covered in English names and selecting one almost at random. From that moment, his given name was no longer used inside the school. His identity, as recognized by the institution, began with the name he chose from that blackboard. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A name is not just a label. It carries family history, community connection, and cultural meaning. Replacing it on the first day of arrival is not an educational decision. It is an identity decision. Language prohibition followed the same pattern. Children were forbidden from speaking their native languages inside the schools. This was not a soft discouragement. It was an enforced rule with consequences. Children who were caught speaking their own languages faced physical punishment. The specifics of that punishment varied across institutions and across time, but the rule itself was consistent across the system. That consistency is important. It suggests this was not a policy left to individual administrators to interpret. It was a structural feature of how the schools operated. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Language is not separate from learning. Language is how learning happens. Forbidding a child from speaking the only language they know is not a neutral educational decision. It creates an immediate and significant barrier to comprehension, to communication, and to the development of trust between student and teacher. Some defenders of the system have argued that English language instruction was simply a practical necessity. Children needed to learn English to function in American society, and immersion was an effective method. That argument has a surface logic. But immersion, as an educational method, works differently from prohibition. Immersion introduces a new language while maintaining access to the first. Prohibition removes the first language entirely and punishes its use. Those are not the same approach. They produce different experiences for the child, and they reflect different underlying intentions. The distinction between those two methods is something the official explanation does not fully address. The government's own 2024 investigation into the boarding school system used specific language to describe what happened inside these institutions. It called the methods used systematic, militarized, and identity alteration methodologies. Read those words carefully. Systematic means the methods were organized and consistent across the system, not accidental or locally determined. Militarized means the environment and structure resembled military conditioning more than academic education. Identity alteration means the deliberate changing of who a child understood themselves to be. That language did not come from critics of the program. It did not come from advocacy organizations or opposition researchers. It came from the federal government reviewing its own historical record. That is a significant distinction. When an institution uses that kind of language to describe itself, the gap between stated intention and documented practice becomes very difficult to close. And this is where a basic logical question becomes difficult to answer within the official framing. If the goal was to prepare children for modern life, why was the first step the removal of everything that connected them to their existing life? Education, in its most fundamental form, builds on what a student already knows. A teacher who wants a child to learn something new begins with what the child already understands. That is not a modern educational theory. It is a basic principle of how human learning works. But the boarding school system did not begin with what the children already knew. It began by systematically removing what they knew. The language was taken. The name was taken. The clothing was taken. The hair was taken. The family was taken. What remained after all of that removal was a child who had been deliberately disconnected from every reference point they possessed. That is not a foundation for education. It is the removal of one. The parental involvement question adds another layer. In a genuine educational program, families are considered partners. They are informed about their children's progress. They are consulted on significant decisions. They are allowed to visit. They are given pathways to stay connected to their children's development. The boarding school system operated differently. Children were sent long distances from home, sometimes across multiple states. Communication with families was limited and in some cases actively discouraged. Visits were rare. The physical distance alone made ongoing family involvement nearly impossible for most families. Whether that distance was a practical byproduct of school locations or a deliberate design feature is a question the record does not fully answer. Record keeping is another area where the documented history raises questions. A system genuinely committed to the welfare of its students would be expected to maintain careful records, medical records, academic records, correspondence with families, documentation of significant decisions affecting individual children. Some records from the boarding school system do exist. The government reviewed 103 million pages of its own documents during its recent investigation, but the records that exist are uneven in quality and incomplete in coverage. Families searching today for information about ancestors who attended the schools frequently encounter gaps. Deaths were not always documented in detail. Causes were not always recorded. Names were changed, and the original names were not always cross-referenced. The record that survives is large in volume but inconsistent in what it actually contains. The government's investigation also confirmed that the schools used physical punishment as an enforcement mechanism for the behavioral and linguistic rules. Children who broke the rules, who spoke their languages, who resisted the changes being imposed on them, faced consequences that went beyond academic discipline. The use of physical punishment to enforce cultural compliance is a detail that sits uncomfortably inside an educational framing. Punishment in schools is typically connected to behavior that disrupts learning or harms others. Punishment for speaking one's own language is something different. It is punishment for being who you are. That distinction is not a minor one. Some historians argue that these methods should be understood within the context of the era. Educational practices in the late 1800s were generally harsher than modern standards. Physical discipline was common in American schools broadly. The cultural assumptions of the period shaped what officials believed was appropriate. Those arguments exist in the scholarly record, and they are not without some basis. But this is where a specific problem remains. Even accepting the context of the era, the methods used in the boarding schools go further than standard educational practice of the time in ways that are specific and documented. The systematic removal of names, languages, clothing, and family connection was not standard practice for schools educating white American children during the same period. The difference in treatment is documented, and that difference requires an explanation that the official framing does not fully provide. What the documented record shows, taken together, is a system that began by removing the identity of the children it claimed to be educating. The removal was not gradual. It was not gentle. It was immediate, structured, and enforced. The government's own language confirms this. The question that remains open is what that removal was actually for. The official answer points to assimilation. But assimilation as an educational goal does not require the destruction of a child's existing identity as a first step. It requires building something new. The system documented here did not begin by building. It began by taking away. And that inconsistency, sitting at the center of the official explanation, does not resolve itself no matter how long it is examined. To understand how a single school in Pennsylvania grew into a nationwide system spanning 37 states, it helps to step back from the institution itself and look at the broader country it was operating inside. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School did not appear in isolation. It appeared at a specific moment in American history, during a specific set of political and economic pressures, and it offered something that the federal government found useful. To understand why the system expanded the way it did, and why it expanded so quickly, those pressures need to be examined, because the growth of the boarding school system was not simply the result of an educational idea that proved popular. It was the result of something larger happening in the country at the same time. The 1860s and 1870s were decades defined by movement. The United States was pushing westward at a pace that was reshaping the continent. Railroads were being built across territories that had been home to native communities for generations. Settlers were following those railroads in large numbers. The federal government was actively encouraging this expansion through land policies designed to move people west and open new territories for agriculture, mining, and development. This was the defining national project of the era, and it was running directly into the fact that vast portions of the western continent were already occupied. Native American nations held territories that the expansion required. That collision was the central political problem the government was trying to solve. Military conflict had been the primary tool for addressing that problem for decades. The government had fought a long series of wars and campaigns against native nations across the continent. Those conflicts were costly in money, in soldiers, and in political reputation. By the 1870s, there was growing pressure from certain quarters of American public life to find a different approach. Some religious organizations and reform groups argued that warfare was morally indefensible and that a more civilized policy was needed. Some government officials agreed, though their reasons were not always purely moral. A cheaper alternative to ongoing military campaigns was also an attractive one from a budget perspective. The political and economic case for a non-military approach was building. This is the environment into which Captain Pratt introduced his model. He was not the only person proposing educational approaches to what government officials called the Indian problem. But he was persistent. He had practical experience from his work with native prisoners in Florida, and he was persuasive in making his case to the officials who controlled federal funding. His argument was that the school could accomplish what the military had not. It could transform native children into participants in American society. It could solve the problem without the cost and controversy of continued warfare. That argument was heard by people who had reason to find it attractive, and Carlisle received federal support. The reframing that Pratt's model offered is worth examining carefully. Military campaigns against native communities were difficult to defend publicly in straightforward terms. Removing children from their families and placing them in distant institutions was also something that required careful language to present acceptably. The boarding school system was presented using the language of rescue, civilization, and opportunity. Children were not being taken. They were being saved. Communities were not being disrupted. They were being helped toward a better future. Cultural practices were not being destroyed. They were being replaced with something more suitable for modern life. That language appeared consistently in government communications, in public statements, and in the fundraising materials used to attract donations from churches and private supporters. It made the program easier to defend and easier to fund. But there is a detail in the background of this period that adds a significant layer of complexity to the official framing. In 1887, 8 years after Carlisle opened its doors, Congress passed a law known as the Dawes Act. It was also called the General Allotment Act. On the surface, it was presented as a land reform policy designed to help Native Americans become independent landowners. The law divided communally held tribal lands into individual parcels. Each head of household would receive a specific allotment of land, either 160 acres of farmland or 320 acres of grazing land, depending on the territory. The idea, as it was presented publicly, was that individual land ownership would encourage farming and self-sufficiency among Native communities. That is the official explanation for the Dawes Act, and it has the same surface logic as the official explanation for the boarding schools. Both were framed as policies designed to benefit Native people by bringing them into alignment with mainstream American practices. Individual land ownership was a core value in American economic life. Education in English and Western trades was presented as the path to economic participation. The two policies, taken together, were framed as a comprehensive approach to integration. That framing was consistent, and it was publicly persuasive. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult when the outcomes are examined. Before the Dawes Act was passed, Native American nations collectively held approximately 138 million acres of land across the United States. That is a documented figure. By 1934, roughly 5 decades after the law passed, that number had fallen to approximately 48 million acres. 90 million acres transferred out of Native ownership in roughly 50 years. That is not a small shift. It is a transfer of 2/3 of all tribal land holdings within a single human lifetime. The mechanism for that transfer was the Dawes Act itself. The law divided communal land into individual parcels. Whatever land remained after the parcels were assigned was declared surplus. Surplus land was then open for purchase by white settlers at prices set by the government. The surplus category consumed enormous amounts of territory, and the transfer was legal, documented, and structured by federal law. Now consider that timeline against the boarding school system. Carlisle opened in 1879. The Dawes Act passed in 1887. The school system expanded rapidly through the 1890s and into the early 1900s. By 1926, more than 80% of Native school-aged children were inside the system. The land transfer was happening across the same decades. Children were being removed from their communities and placed in distant schools, while the land those communities held was being divided, reclassified, and transferred. Those two processes were running simultaneously. Whether that simultaneity was coordinated or coincidental is a question historians continue to examine. But the overlap is not vague or approximate. It is specific and documented. There is a detail inside that overlap that is particularly difficult to set aside. The National Archives contains records showing that young children who had inherited land allotments under the Dawes Act were frequently unable to farm or manage those allotments because they had been sent away to boarding schools. The children who stood to inherit land were not present on that land. They were hundreds or thousands of miles away, inside institutions. The land sat without management. In some cases, it was leased to white farmers under arrangements that benefited the leaseholders more than the native landowners. In other cases, it was eventually classified as abandoned or surplus and transferred. When the children eventually returned, the land was often gone. That sequence, removal followed by land loss, is documented in the archives. It is not a theoretical connection. It is a recorded pattern. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado noticed this pattern while it was still developing. In 1881, 2 years after Carlisle opened and 6 years before the Dawes Act passed, Teller made a public statement about the direction of federal Indian policy. He said the real aim of the policies being discussed was to access native land, and that the provisions appearing to benefit native people were, in his own words, just a pretext. That statement came from inside the government. Teller was a United States senator. He was not an outside critic or an opposition researcher. He was a participant in the political system, making that observation from within it. The fact that his concern was documented in public during that period, and did not significantly alter the course of the policies he was describing, is itself a detail worth examining. The reframing of removal as education served a specific function in this context. A policy described as taking children from their families to open their land for settlement would face obvious political opposition. A policy described as rescuing children and providing them with modern education was far easier to fund and defend. The language used to describe the schools was not neutral. It was selected, and the selection served the purpose of making a controversial program acceptable to a public that might otherwise have questioned it. That observation does not require assuming a single coordinated conspiracy. It simply requires reading the language that was used and comparing it to the outcomes that resulted. Some historians argue that the land transfer and the school system were separate policies that happened to operate in the same period. They point out that the officials who designed the educational programs were not always the same officials who designed the land policies. They argue that attributing a single unified intention to what were in practice multiple overlapping bureaucratic programs overstates the coordination involved. Those arguments exist in the scholarly record, and they reflect a real complexity in how large government systems operate. Policies can produce connected outcomes without having been consciously designed to do so. That possibility deserves to be taken seriously. At the same time, other historians and native scholars point to the documented outcomes and argue that the connection between the school system and the land transfer is too consistent and too specific to be dismissed as coincidence. Vine Deloria Jr., a Standing Rock Sioux scholar, described the two policies together as a coordinated effort to separate people from both their land and their cultural identity. He used the phrase "a race between the stealers of men's land and the stealers of men's souls." That framing places the two policies in direct relationship with each other. It is a specific interpretation, and not every historian accepts it in full. But the documented facts it draws on, the land numbers, the school numbers, the timing, the outcomes, are not in dispute. What remains unclear is the question of intention. The outcomes of the two policies, taken together, are documented. The school system removed children from their communities. The land policy transferred land from those communities. Both happened in the same decades. Both were funded and structured by the federal government. Both used language of benefit and improvement to describe what they were doing. Whether those connections reflect a deliberate design, an emergent pattern, or a coincidence of historical timing is a question that the available record does not fully answer. The documents that might resolve it, including the private archives of the religious organizations that operated half the schools, remain largely inaccessible. And without that full record, the question of what was intended and what simply resulted stays open. The overlap is documented. The explanation for it is not. Here is where the official explanation starts to weaken in a more specific way. Not through broad arguments or general observations, through a specific program, a specific set of records, and a specific sequence of events that the documented history makes difficult to explain away. Up to this point, the inconsistencies between the stated goals of the boarding school system and its actual methods could still be attributed to poor planning, cultural assumptions of the era, or the gap between institutional intention and institutional practice. Those explanations have some room to operate, but what the next layer of the record shows is something more precise, and precision is harder to set aside than general patterns. The boarding schools operated a program that was built into the structure of the system from relatively early in its history. It was called the outing system. The basic mechanics of the outing system were straightforward. During summer months, when students were not attending classes, they were not sent home to their families. Instead, they were placed with white American families in surrounding towns and rural areas. They lived in those households, sometimes for a few months, sometimes for longer periods. They performed domestic work inside the home and agricultural labor on the land. They cooked, cleaned, washed, and worked in fields. In exchange, they received room and board. In many cases, they received little or no additional payment for the work they performed. The official framing of the outing system described it as practical work experience. It was presented as an extension of the school's educational mission. Students were learning real-world skills by living and working alongside American families. They were practicing their English in everyday settings. They were gaining exposure to American domestic and agricultural life. That framing appeared in official school reports, in government communications, and in the public materials used to promote the boarding school program. It positioned the outing system as a natural continuation of what the schools were trying to accomplish. On the surface, that framing has a certain consistency with the broader stated goals of the program. But this is where it becomes unclear. If the outing system was genuinely about practical education, certain things would follow. The work assigned would align with the skills the students were being trained for inside the school. The experience gained would prepare them for the lives they would return to when they eventually left the institution. The compensation would reflect the value of the labor being performed, and the outcomes, measured against the students' futures, would show some meaningful benefit. When the outing system is examined against those expectations, the alignment is not consistent, and the records that document what actually happened raise questions that the official framing does not fully answer. Start with the question of skills alignment. The boarding schools taught boys trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, and shoemaking. They taught girls domestic skills, including sewing, cooking, and housekeeping. The outing system placed students with white families performing household labor and farm work. Some of that work overlapped with what was being taught inside the schools, but much of it did not. Students were performing general labor tasks determined by the needs of the families hosting them, not by any educational plan connected to their school curriculum. The work was useful to the families. Whether it was useful to the students in any structured educational sense is a question the records do not clearly answer. Now consider the land question alongside this. Under the Dawes Act, which passed in 1887, Native families received individual land allotments. Those allotments were parcels of land that family members were expected to farm and maintain. Children who were heirs to those allotments stood to inherit real property. That property had value. It required presence, management, and agricultural knowledge specific to the region and the land type involved. But those children were not on their land. They were inside boarding schools during the academic year and inside white households during the summer months under the outing system. They were not learning how to farm their specific allotments. They were not present on their land. And in many cases, the land did not wait for them. The National Archives contains records documenting what happened to allotted land when the children who stood to inherit it were absent. Land that was not being actively farmed or managed was in some cases leased to white farmers and ranchers under arrangements administered by federal agents. The terms of those leases frequently favored the leaseholders. In other cases, land that appeared unoccupied or unmanaged was eventually reclassified and transferred. The children came back, years later in some cases, to find that the land their families had been assigned under the Dawes Act was no longer available to them. The allotment system had promised individual land ownership. The boarding school system had removed the people who would have worked that land, and the outcome, documented in the archives, was land loss on a scale that the official framing of either policy does not account for. That detail sounds minor at first, a scheduling conflict between school attendance and land management. But it is not minor when examined more closely. The children were not simply away at school during a temporary period. Many of them spent years inside the boarding school system, some from very early childhood through adolescence. The outing system extended their absence through the summers. By the time some students returned to their communities, they had been away for the better part of a decade. The land that had been allotted to their families had been managed, leased, reclassified, or transferred during their absence. And the skills they had been taught inside the schools, blacksmithing, sewing, domestic service, were not the skills needed to reclaim or work the specific land they would have inherited. The sequence produced a predictable outcome, and the predictability of that outcome is what makes it difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. The outing system also raises a more direct question about the nature of the labor being performed. Students placed with white families were doing real work. That work had real economic value for the families receiving it. Household labor, cooking, cleaning, and childcare represented significant time and effort. Agricultural labor in fields represented measurable economic output. In many cases, students received room and board but no wages. In some documented cases, they received small payments, but those payments were frequently held by the school administration rather than given directly to the student. The economic relationship between the student and the hosting family was not equal. It was not designed to be. And describing unpaid or minimally compensated labor performed by children living away from their families as practical work experience requires a careful look at whose interests that framing actually served. This is also where a question about the outing system's broader function becomes relevant. The schools taught skills. The outing system put students to work. The work benefited white American households and farms. The compensation was minimal. The educational value, measured against the students' actual futures, was inconsistent. When those facts are laid out together, the outing system begins to look less like an educational extension program and more like a labor supply mechanism. That interpretation is not accepted by all historians. Some argue the outing system genuinely reflected the era's understanding of vocational training, and that placing students with families was considered a legitimate pedagogical approach. Those arguments exist in the scholarly record, but they do not fully resolve the compensation question or the land displacement question. Both remain open, and this is where a voice from inside the government itself becomes particularly significant. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado made a public statement in 1881, 2 years after Carlisle opened and 6 years before the Dawes Act passed. He was not an outside observer. He was a United States Senator, a participant in the legislative system that was designing and funding these policies. And he stated publicly, in documented remarks, that the real aim of the policies being constructed around Native communities was to access native land. He said the educational provisions, the language of rescue and civilization and opportunity, were in his own words just the pretext, not a side effect, not an unintended consequence. A pretext. That is a specific word. It means the stated reason is not the actual reason. A sitting senator used that word to describe active federal policy while that policy was being built. That statement did not stop the policies from moving forward. The Dawes Act passed 6 years after Teller made that observation. The boarding school system continued expanding for decades after his remarks. His concern, documented in public, did not significantly alter the course of what was happening. That fact raises its own question. When a senator identifies a problem with a policy's stated intentions, while that policy is actively being constructed, and the policy continues unchanged, what does that suggest about the priorities of the people making the decisions? The answer is not obvious, but the question is not easily dismissed. The significance of Teller's statement is not simply that one senator disagreed with the direction of federal policy. That happens regularly in any legislative system. The significance is that his disagreement was specific. He was not arguing about methods or efficiency or cost. He was arguing about intent. He was saying that the stated purpose of the policy was not its real purpose. And he was saying this from inside the government, based on his own observations of what was being planned and why. That kind of internal dissent, documented and specific, is not a minor footnote. It is a primary source that speaks directly to the question of what these policies were actually designed to accomplish. Some historians argue that Teller's remarks reflected his own political position and should not be read as an accurate description of the intentions of everyone involved in designing the boarding school and land policies. That caution is reasonable. A single senator's statement does not establish the intentions of an entire government program. Other officials genuinely believed the policies were beneficial. The motivations within any large bureaucratic system are never perfectly uniform. Those complexities deserve acknowledgement, but the existence of competing intentions within a system does not eliminate the significance of documented outcomes. And the outcomes here are specific. Children were removed. Land was transferred. The two processes ran simultaneously. A senator noticed a connection and named it publicly. The records confirm the sequence he was describing. What the outing system and the land record together reveal is a set of specific inconsistencies that the official framing of the boarding school program does not adequately explain. The program taught skills that did not match the land the students would have inherited. It removed students from their communities during the exact period when that land was being divided and transferred. It placed them in unpaid or minimally compensated labor situations that benefited others more clearly than they benefited the students. And it did all of this while a senator was publicly stating that the underlying aim was land access, not education. The official explanation describes the boarding schools as an educational program. The record describes something that produced different outcomes than education alone would explain. And the gap between those two descriptions is specific enough and documented enough that it remains open as a question regardless of how the official framing is applied to it. The documentation becomes harder to set aside when you move past the policies and the programs and start looking at the numbers directly. Numbers have a particular quality in historical investigation. They do not carry tone. They do not reflect the intentions of the people who compiled them. They simply represent what was recorded. And when the numbers attached to the boarding school system are examined carefully, they produce a question that the official framing of the program has not fully answered. Not a question invented by critics or constructed from assumptions. A question that comes directly from the documented record itself. A question about how many children entered these institutions and did not come out alive. Start with Carlisle, because Carlisle is where the documentation is most developed and most accessible. The school operated from 1879 until 1918, when it was closed and the grounds returned to military use. During those roughly 4 decades of operation, the school buried at least 186 children on its campus. That number comes from the documented burial record. It is not an estimate produced by outside researchers working from incomplete information. It is drawn from the school's own records and the physical evidence of the graves themselves. 186 children at one school, over 4 decades. That is an average of more than 4 children per year dying inside a single educational institution. But that average understates the reality in certain periods. The mortality was not evenly distributed across the school's history. Some years saw higher concentrations of deaths than others. The conditions inside the school, including overcrowding, inadequate ventilation, limited medical care, and the physical and psychological stress of removal from family and community, contributed to the spread of disease. Tuberculosis was particularly significant. It moved through populations living in close quarters with limited access to treatment. Children who arrived at Carlisle healthy could become sick within months. Some recovered, some did not. The school's infirmary records, where they survive, document this pattern. But the infirmary records, like many of the school's administrative documents, are not complete. Gaps exist in the documentation, and those gaps mean the number 186 should be understood as a floor, not a ceiling. There's a further detail inside that number that the historical record confirms. Some of the graves at Carlisle hold more than one child. That fact is documented. The physical space of the cemetery was limited, and in some cases multiple children were buried together. That detail is not elaborated on extensively in the official record. The reasons for it are not fully explained in the surviving documentation. It is simply noted as a fact in the accounts of those who examined the cemetery. And it is the kind of fact that raises a question without providing an answer. A school that buries children in shared graves is a school where the management of child death had become routine enough to require practical solutions. The cemetery itself has a complicated history that adds another layer to the documentation problem. In 1927, nearly a decade after Carlisle closed, the Army relocated the cemetery. The grounds were being repurposed, and the graves needed to be moved. During that relocation process, some remains were lost. That is the documented account. Remains that had been buried on the campus of an operational federal institution, marked and recorded at the time of burial, were lost during a government-managed relocation process. Families who have spent generations trying to bring their children home have encountered that loss as a wall in their search. The remains are not missing in the sense of being hidden. They are missing in the sense that the relocation was not conducted with the precision that would have been required to preserve a complete record. Whether that imprecision was the result of negligence, resource limitations, or something else is not explained in the available documentation. Now move beyond Carlisle to the broader system. In 2024, the Washington Post conducted an investigation into student deaths across the entire boarding school system, covering the period from 1828 to 1970. The investigation identified more than 3,100 student deaths documented across that system. That figure is significant on its own, but it becomes more significant when it is placed next to another number. Just months before the Washington Post published its findings, the federal government released its own investigation into the boarding school system. That government investigation reported a student death toll that was approximately one-third of what the Washington Post identified. The same historical period, the same institutional system, two investigations producing numbers that differ by a factor of 3. That discrepancy is not a minor statistical variation. A factor of 3 is a substantial difference. It means that either the government's investigation missed a large portion of the documented deaths, or the Washington Post's investigation included deaths that the government did not count using the same criteria. Both possibilities raise questions. If the government's investigation missed deaths that were findable through independent research using available records, that raises questions about the completeness of the government's review methodology. If the two investigations use different counting criteria, the question becomes which criteria more accurately reflects the real toll. The government acknowledged that its own count was incomplete. That acknowledgement is documented, but the acknowledgement did not come with a revised figure or a timeline for producing one. The Department of the Interior, in its own language describing its own investigation, stated that the real total of student deaths was likely in the thousands or tens of thousands. Read that range carefully. Thousands to tens of thousands. That is not a narrow estimate. It is a range that spans an order of magnitude. When a government agency describes the likely death toll of a program it administered using a range that wide, it is communicating something specific about the state of its own records. It is saying that the documentation is incomplete enough that the actual number cannot be determined with confidence. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The government reviewed 103 million pages of its own records to produce its investigation report. After reviewing 103 million pages, it still could not narrow the estimated death toll below a range spanning tens of thousands. That is a significant statement about what those records do and do not contain. The question this raises is straightforward, but not easy to answer. If the boarding school system was primarily an educational program, what explains the scale of child mortality documented across it? Schools have accidents. Schools experience outbreaks of illness. Children die in institutional settings for reasons that are not always preventable. That is true of educational institutions broadly and across history. But the numbers attached to the boarding school system are not consistent with what would be expected from routine institutional mortality. A documented death toll that the administering government agency estimates at thousands to tens of thousands across a system that operated for roughly 150 years is not a background rate of incidental loss. It is a pattern that requires an explanation. Some historians point to disease as the primary explanation. Tuberculosis and other infectious diseases were widespread in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Children living in close quarters in institutional settings were vulnerable. Native children, who had not been exposed to certain diseases in the same ways as white American children, may have had less resistance to specific illnesses circulating inside the schools. Those factors are real and documented. Disease did kill children inside these institutions. That is not in dispute. But this is where a specific question emerges. If disease was the primary driver of mortality, the schools would have been expected to respond by improving conditions, increasing ventilation, reducing overcrowding, and expanding medical care. The documented record of what schools actually did in response to disease outbreaks is uneven. In some cases, improvements were made. In others, the conditions that contributed to disease spread continued for years after the problem was identified. Luther Standing Bear arrived at Carlisle in 1879, the school's first year of operation. He was one of the original students. He lived inside the institution, watched what happened around him, and later wrote about what he witnessed. He became an author, a Lakota chief, and one of the most significant Native American voices of the early 20th century. His written account of his time at Carlisle is a primary source document, and in that account, he wrote specifically about the cemetery. He wrote that most of the graves in Carlisle's cemetery belonged to little ones. He was there. He saw the graves being dug. He knew the children who were buried in them. His account is not a second-hand report or a later interpretation of historical records. It is a first-hand observation from someone who was present during the period being documented. That detail sounds important at first, and it becomes more important when it is examined against the institutional record. The school's administration produced reports, photographs, and promotional materials that presented Carlisle as a successful and beneficial program. Those materials were sent to Washington, to donors, and to the public. The photographs showed students in uniforms performing trades. The reports described educational progress and the success of assimilation. The promotional framing was consistent and deliberate. But Luther Standing Bear's account describes a different reality running alongside that promotional framing. Children were dying, the graves were real, and the institution continued producing promotional materials while those graves were being filled. The question of what families were told when their children died inside the schools is one that the surviving records do not consistently answer. Some families received notifications. Some did not. Some received remains. Others were told that remains could not be returned, or were given no information at all. The distance between the schools and the home communities made verification nearly impossible for most families. A family on a reservation hundreds of miles from Carlisle had no practical mechanism to confirm what they were told about their child's death or burial. That distance was a structural feature of the system, and in the context of child mortality, it meant that the institution controlled not just the child's life inside the school, but the information available to the family about that child's death. The 800 number is one that appears in the government's own investigation and has not been resolved. More than 800 children remain buried at or near the schools where they were sent. The government has confirmed at least 74 burial sites at 65 different school locations and expects to find more as the investigation continues. Families have been attempting to bring their children home for over a century. In some cases, they know where their relative is buried. In others, the records are incomplete or the remains were lost during relocations, like the one at Carlisle in 1927. The process of identifying, locating, and returning remains is ongoing. It does not have a completion date. It does not have a fully funded framework. It is simply continuing slowly against a record that is large in volume and inconsistent in detail. What the mortality numbers reveal, taken together, is a gap between what the boarding school system was described as doing and what the documented record shows it produced. An educational program produces graduates. It produces skills. It produces outcomes that can be measured against the lives of the people who pass through it. The boarding school system produced some of those things for some students, but it also produced graves. Documented graves at documented locations, containing children who arrived at the schools alive. The government has acknowledged this. The Washington Post investigation confirmed it at a scale 3 times larger than the government's own count, and the Department of the Interior has stated in its own words that the real toll is likely far higher than what any investigation has so far been able to document. That acknowledgement is in the record. The full accounting behind it is not. When you step back from individual schools and look at the system as a whole, something becomes visible that is harder to see when focusing on a single institution. Patterns. Specific, repeated, consistent patterns that appear across hundreds of schools in dozens of states over many decades. These patterns are not subtle. They are not the kind of similarities that might emerge naturally when many different institutions independently make similar decisions. They are precise enough and consistent enough to suggest something more structured than coincidence. And when those patterns are examined alongside the question of records, a second layer of questions opens up that the available documentation does not fully resolve. The most immediate pattern is the one involving names. Across the boarding school system, in institutions operated by the federal government and in institutions operated by religious organizations partnered with the government, children were renamed upon arrival. This was not a practice that varied significantly from school to school or region to region. It was consistent. Children arrived with names given to them by their families, names that carried meaning within their communities and their cultures. Those names were replaced with English names. Sometimes children were given a list and told to choose. Sometimes names were assigned directly by administrators. The original names were not preserved alongside the new ones in any systematic way. In many cases, the cross-referencing between a child's original name and their assigned English name was incomplete or absent entirely. That gap in documentation has created a specific problem for families and researchers working today to trace their ancestors through the boarding school era. The language prohibition follows the same pattern of consistency. Across the system, in schools separated by thousands of miles and operating under different administrative structures, children were forbidden from speaking their native languages. The rule was enforced. Children who broke it faced consequences. That consequence was typically physical punishment. The consistency of this rule across such a large and geographically dispersed system is a detail worth sitting with. In a network of more than 400 institutions, local administrators made many decisions independently. They chose staff, managed budgets, organized curricula, and handled day-to-day operations according to their own judgment and resources. But the language prohibition was not left to local judgment. It was present everywhere. That level of consistency in a specific rule points toward a centrally determined policy rather than a locally emergent practice. The physical appearance requirements follow the same pattern. Military-style uniforms were standard across the system. Haircutting upon arrival was standard. The visual transformation of the children, from their traditional appearance to an appearance defined by the institution, was a consistent feature across hundreds of schools. The uniformity of that transformation applied regardless of which tribe a child came from, which region of the country the school was located in, or which organization was administering the institution, suggests it was not an aesthetic preference of individual administrators. It was a structural requirement, something built into the design of the system rather than chosen by the people running individual schools. Physical punishment for cultural expression appears in documented accounts from schools across the country. Children were punished for speaking their languages, for practicing traditional customs, for attempting to maintain connections to their cultural identity inside the institutional environment. The documented accounts of this punishment come from multiple schools, multiple states, multiple decades, and multiple tribal communities. The consistency of those accounts across such a wide range of sources is significant. When the same experience is described independently by people who attended different institutions in different periods, the similarity of those descriptions points toward a shared structural feature rather than a series of unrelated local decisions. The outing system, which placed children with white families during summer months to perform labor, also appears across the system with notable consistency. It was not unique to Carlisle. It was replicated in schools across different states and regions. The basic mechanics were the same. Children were placed in households. They performed domestic and agricultural work. Compensation was minimal or absent. The program was framed as practical education. That framing appeared in official reports from multiple institutions using similar language. The consistency of both the program and its official justification across geographically separated institutions again points toward central coordination rather than independent invention. And then there are the cemeteries. This is the detail that is most difficult to explain as a product of local decision-making. Schools across the system had burial grounds on their campuses or in close proximity to them. Children who died inside the institutions were buried there. The government has confirmed at least 74 burial sites at 65 different school locations and expects to find more as its investigation continues. The existence of campus cemeteries at institutions spread across 37 states is not a pattern that emerges from independent local choices. Building a cemetery on or near a school campus requires anticipating that children will die there in numbers significant enough to require dedicated burial space. That anticipation, built into the physical infrastructure of schools across the country, is a structural feature of the system. It is not an accident. This level of consistency across more than 400 institutions over many decades suggests something specific about how the system was organized. Individual administrators did not independently arrive at the same decisions about names, languages, uniforms, punishment, labor programs, and burial infrastructure. These were structural features. They were built into the design of the system at a level above the individual school. They were transmitted through policy, through training, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs oversight structure, and through the partnerships with religious organizations that operated roughly half of all the schools. The consistency is itself evidence of coordination, and that coordination raises a question about accountability, because a coordinated system has identifiable designers. Now consider the documentation question alongside that pattern of coordination. The government's recent investigation into the boarding school system reviewed 103 million pages of its own records. That number is significant in two directions at once. On one hand, it demonstrates that the paper trail left by this system is enormous. 103 million pages means the system was extensively documented. Reports were filed, records were kept, communications were sent and preserved. The administrative infrastructure of the boarding school system generated documentation on a scale that took a major federal investigation years to review. That level of documentation does not emerge from a loosely organized collection of independent institutions. It emerges from a centrally administered system with consistent reporting requirements. But this is where it becomes unclear. If 103 million pages of records exist, and if those records were extensive enough to require a major federal review to process, why do researchers and families searching for information about the boarding school era consistently describe the records as difficult or impossible to access? Those two facts sit next to each other in the current historical situation, and they do not fully fit together. A massive record exists. The government reviewed it, and yet the people most directly affected by what those records document, the descendants of the children who attended the schools, are told that the information they are looking for is largely unavailable. That gap requires an explanation that has not been clearly provided. Part of the answer involves the distinction between records that exist and records that are accessible. A document can be preserved in a federal archive without being practically available to a family conducting genealogical research. Access to federal records is governed by a complex system of disclosure rules, retention schedules, and administrative processes that do not always align with the needs of individual researchers. Records that were reviewed by a federal investigation team with institutional access and legal authority are not automatically available to a family member submitting a records request. That distinction is real, but it does not fully explain why. After a major federal investigation acknowledged the scope of the boarding school system and its impacts, a clear and accessible pathway for families to access relevant records has not been established. The religious institution question adds a further complication. Roughly half of all the schools in the boarding school system were operated by churches and religious organizations rather than directly by the federal government. Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, and other denominations administered these schools under partnership agreements with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Those institutions received federal funding. They operated within a federally designed policy framework. They implemented the same methods, the same name changes, the same language prohibitions, the same labor programs that appeared across the government-run schools. But their internal records are not subject to the same federal disclosure requirements that apply to government documents. Their archives remain private, and those archives have not been opened as part of any mandatory disclosure process connected to the boarding school investigations. That detail sounds administrative at first, until it is examined more closely. If roughly half the schools in the system were operated by religious organizations, then roughly half the records of what happened inside those schools are held in private archives. The government reviewed 103 million pages of its own records and still said the count of student deaths was likely in the thousands to tens of thousands, meaning the record was incomplete even after that review. If the records from the religious institutions were added to that review, the picture would be more complete. But those records have not been required to be opened. Whatever they contain about the children who passed through those institutions, the deaths that occurred inside them, the decisions that were made about individual children, and the communications between the religious administrators and the federal officials who funded them remains behind closed doors. That gap has not been explained in a way that accounts for its full significance. Some institutions have voluntarily begun reviewing and sharing their own historical records related to the boarding school era. Individual dioceses and religious orders have commissioned internal historical reviews and in some cases released findings publicly. Those efforts exist and deserve acknowledgement. But voluntary disclosure is different from required disclosure. What is shared voluntarily is selected. What is required to be disclosed is complete. The distinction matters when the records in question document the treatment, and in some cases the deaths, of children who were placed in those institutions by federal policy. The standard for what those records should contain, and who should have access to them, is a question that has not been resolved. What the pattern of consistency across the system and the pattern of inconsistency in the records reveals together is something worth examining carefully. A coordinated system that operated for 150 years left an enormous paper trail. That trail was extensive enough to require a major federal review. But the trail is not fully accessible to the families most affected by what it documents, and roughly half of it sits in private archives that have not been subject to any mandatory disclosure. The coordination is visible in the methods. The documentation is confirmed by the volume of records reviewed, and the gap between what exists and what is accessible remains open. Those three facts sit together in the current historical situation without a complete explanation for how they fit. The scope of what the boarding school system affected does not end when the schools themselves began closing. That is one of the more significant details in this history, and it is one that does not fit comfortably inside the framing of the boarding schools as a limited historical episode confined to a specific era. If the system had been a bounded program that operated for a defined period and then stopped, the story would have a clearer shape. It would have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the documented record does not show that shape. What it shows instead is a pattern that continued well beyond the institutional framework that originally produced it. The mechanism changed. The institutions changed. The language used to describe what was happening changed. But the outcome, children being removed from native families and placed outside their communities, continued for generations after the boarding school era is typically said to have ended. To understand what happened after the schools, it helps to understand what the schools themselves produced in the communities they affected. Children who spent years inside boarding school institutions returned to their communities, changed in specific ways. Some had lost fluency in their native languages. Some had lost familiarity with the cultural practices of their communities. Some had spent so many years away that the social networks and family relationships that would have anchored them at home had thinned or broken. The communities themselves had also changed during the years the children were away. Land had been transferred. Economic structures had shifted. The boarding school system did not simply remove children temporarily and return them to intact communities. It removed children from communities that were simultaneously being disrupted by the land policies running alongside the school system. The return, when it came, was often to a situation that did not resemble what had existed before the removal. That disruption produced effects that extended into the next generation and the generation after that. Communities that had experienced widespread removal of children over decades faced specific challenges in transmitting cultural knowledge, language, and parenting practices across generations. A parent who had spent their own childhood inside a boarding school institution, separated from family, subjected to a structured environment that replaced their cultural framework with an institutional one, would return to their community with a different relationship to the practices of raising children than someone who had grown up within their community. That is not a criticism of the individuals involved. It is a documented consequence of what institutional removal does to the transmission of family and community knowledge across generations. By the time the boarding school era was winding down, those generational effects were visible in the data that social welfare agencies were collecting. And this is where the story moves into territory that most accounts of the boarding school system do not follow. By the 1970s, decades after many of the schools had closed or were closing, between 25 and 35% of all Native American children in the United States were still being removed from their homes. That figure comes from the documented record of child welfare placements during that period. 1/4 to 1/3 of all Native children, not inside boarding schools. The schools were largely gone by then. Inside the foster care and adoption system. A different institution. A different administrative framework. But producing a recognizable outcome. The foster care and adoption numbers have a specific detail inside them that makes the pattern harder to dismiss as coincidence. Of the Native children being removed from their homes in the 1970s, 85% were being placed outside their families and outside their communities. That means the children were not simply being moved temporarily to other Native households nearby while a parent addressed a specific difficulty. They were being placed with non-Native families in non-Native communities, sometimes far from their home territories. The placement decisions were being made by state welfare agencies, staffed primarily by non-Native social workers, applying standards developed for non-Native communities. Cultural practices that were normal within Native communities were sometimes interpreted by those agencies as signs of neglect or inadequacy. The result was removal at rates that had no parallel in other American communities. But this is where it becomes unclear in a specific way. The removal of Native children through the foster care system in the 1970s was not happening in a vacuum. It was happening in a country that had, in theory, moved past the policies of the boarding school era. The schools that had been specifically designed to remove Native children from their families and communities had been largely dismantled. New policies existed. New frameworks governed the relationship between the federal government and Native nations, and yet the removal was continuing at rates that, by some measurements, were comparable to what the boarding school system had produced. 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 children, placed outside their communities at a rate of 85%. Those numbers are not marginal. They describe a system that was producing outcomes very similar to the one it had theoretically replaced. The Indian Child Welfare Act was passed by Congress in 1978 specifically in response to this situation. The law established requirements for how child welfare cases involving Native children should be handled. It required that Native tribes be notified when a child was being considered for foster placement or adoption. It established preferences for placing Native children with extended family members, then with other members of the same tribe, then with other Native families, before placement with non-Native families would be considered. It gave tribal courts jurisdiction over child custody proceedings involving tribal members. The law was a direct legislative response to documented removal rates. Its existence confirms that what was happening in the 1970s was recognized at the federal level as a significant and systematic problem requiring a specific legal remedy. That a law of this kind was necessary in 1978 is a detail worth examining carefully. Carlisle opened in 1879. The Indian Child Welfare Act passed in 1978. That is nearly a century. And in that century, the removal of Native children from their families and communities had not stopped. It had changed form. It had moved from one institutional framework to another, but had continued. The question that raises is whether what happened across that century represents a series of separate and unconnected policy failures, each arising from its own causes, or whether it represents something with more continuity than that. The answer to that question is something researchers and historians continue to examine. It does not have a settled consensus, but the timeline is long enough and the consistency of the outcome clear enough that the question does not disappear when it is examined honestly. Some historians and policy researchers argue that the child welfare removals of the 1970s were the result of separate institutional failures that had nothing to do with the boarding school era. They point to broader problems in the American child welfare system during that period, to inadequate training of social workers, to the application of culturally inappropriate standards, and to systemic underfunding of Native communities that created conditions which welfare agencies then interpreted as neglect. Those factors are real and documented. The child welfare system in the 1970s had problems that affected many communities beyond Native ones. The argument that the Native child removal rates were primarily a product of those general systemic failures rather than a specific continuation of earlier policies is not without some basis. At the same time, Other researchers point to the specific numbers and the specific placement patterns and argue that the general systemic explanation does not fully account for what was happening. Removal rates of 25 to 35% affecting a specific population, with 85% of removals placing children outside their communities, even when capable relatives were available, are not outcomes that emerge solely from general systemic failures applied evenly across populations. Those numbers describe something specific happening to a specific community, and the specificity of those numbers, combined with the specificity of the boarding school era that preceded them and the specificity of the law that was required to address them, produces a pattern that is harder to explain as purely coincidental than it might initially appear. The Indian Child Welfare Act itself, in its legislative findings, made a direct connection between the child welfare crisis it was addressing and the history of policies that had preceded it. Congress found, in the text of the law, that there was an alarmingly high percentage of Indian families broken up by the removal of their children. Congress found that the states had often failed to recognize the essential tribal relations and the cultural and social standards prevailing in Indian communities. And Congress found that this situation was the result of a long history of federal policies that had undermined tribal self-governance and community integrity. The law's own legislative record drew a line connecting what was happening in the 1970s to what had happened before. That connection was not made by outside critics. It was made by Congress in the text of the legislation it passed to address the problem. The mechanism of removal had changed significantly between 1879 and 1978. Carlisle used federal authority and direct institutional placement. The 1970s child welfare system used state agencies and judicial processes. The language was different. The administrative structures were different. The people making the decisions were different. But the outcome at the community level, children leaving and not returning, cultural knowledge failing to transmit across generations, family structures disrupted by institutional intervention, was recognizable across both periods. Whether that recognizable outcome reflects a connected policy logic or a repeated pattern of institutional error is a question that the available record does not fully settle. What the 1978 law also reveals is something about what had not happened in the century between Carlisle's opening and its passage. In that century, no federal law had specifically protected Native families from the removal of their children by state welfare agencies. The boarding schools had operated under federal authority. When the schools declined and the foster system expanded, the federal protections that might have limited the new form of removal did not exist. The gap between the end of the school era and the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act is a gap in which removal continued without a specific legal framework designed to prevent it. That gap lasted roughly a generation, and in that generation, the removal rates documented by researchers in the 1970s accumulated. The Indian Child Welfare Act has faced legal challenges since its passage. Its provisions have been contested in court cases that have raised questions about the scope of tribal jurisdiction and the constitutionality of race-based preferences in child placement. Those legal challenges are ongoing and reflect genuine constitutional complexity, but the existence of those challenges does not change what the law was responding to when it was passed. It was responding to documented removal rates. It was responding to a pattern that Congress itself, in the text of a law, connected to a longer history of federal policy affecting Native families. What this period of history reveals, when examined alongside the boarding school era, is a question about continuity that has not been fully resolved. The schools removed children. Then a different system removed children. A law was passed to stop the removal. The law has been challenged. The communities affected by removal across multiple generations are still documenting the effects. The method changed. The institution changed. The language changed. And the question of whether those changes represent genuine discontinuity or variations on a continuous pattern is something the historical record raises without fully answering. The timeline runs from 1879 to 1978 and beyond. That is not a short period. And across that period, the outcome for Native children and Native families remained recognizable in ways that the official explanations for each separate era do not fully account for when they are placed next to each other. Any serious examination of the boarding school system eventually arrives at a point where the historical interpretation itself becomes part of what needs to be examined. The facts of the system are documented. The schools existed. The children were removed. The methods were consistent and structured. The mortality was real. The land transfer happened simultaneously. Those things are confirmed by the record. But what those facts mean, what they reveal about the intentions of the people who designed and administered the system, and what they say about how this history should be understood and taught, is something that different researchers have approached from different directions. And those different approaches produce conclusions that do not fully align with each other. Sitting with that disagreement honestly is part of examining this history with the care it requires. The first interpretive position is the one most closely associated with the official framing of the boarding school era. It holds that Captain Richard Henry Pratt and the officials and educators who built and administered the system genuinely believed they were acting in the interests of Native children and Native communities. This position does not ignore the harshness of the methods used. It acknowledges that the schools impose significant suffering on the children inside them, but it argues that the people making the decisions were operating within the assumptions and values of their historical moment, and that those assumptions, however wrong by today's standards, were sincerely held. Pratt believed that Native Americans were intellectually equal to white Americans. He believed that assimilation was the only path to survival in a changing country. He believed that education, however forcibly delivered, was better than the alternative of ongoing military conflict. Those beliefs are documented in his own words and in the public record he left behind. Within that interpretive framework, the boarding school system is understood as a misguided but genuinely motivated attempt at what its designers considered a humanitarian solution. The suffering produced was real, but it was a consequence of wrong assumptions rather than malicious intent. The land loss in this reading is understood as a separate policy failure rather than a connected objective. The mortality inside the schools is attributed to disease, to the limitations of medical knowledge and institutional resources in the late 19th century, and to the stress of removal rather than to deliberate neglect. The system was wrong, but it was wrong in the way that many historical policies were wrong, through the application of sincere beliefs that history has since shown to be harmful. That interpretation has a certain internal consistency, and it is supported by some of the evidence in the historical record. There are students who attended Carlisle and other boarding schools who described specific benefits from their education. Luther Standing Bear is the most frequently cited example. He arrived at Carlisle as a boy in 1879, learned English, received training in various trades, and went on to become a published author, a Lakota chief, and one of the most significant advocates for Native rights in the early 20th century. His books, written in English and reaching a wide American audience, drew directly on his Carlisle education. He used the tools the school gave him to argue, with considerable force and public impact, for the rights and dignity of his people. That is a specific and documented outcome that the interpretive framework of sincere but misguided policy can point to as evidence. Some families, the record also shows, made deliberate choices to send their children to the boarding schools. They were not always acting under direct coercion. Some parents and community leaders concluded that the world around them was changing in ways their communities could not resist, and that equipping their children with English and with skills recognized by the dominant society was the most practical response available. That calculation was not unreasonable given the conditions those communities faced, and the fact that some families made it voluntarily is part of the historical record that any complete account has to include. It does not resolve the larger questions about the system, but it adds a complexity to the narrative that a purely coercive framing does not fully capture. However, the timeline and the structural outcomes do not fully cooperate with the interpretation of sincere intent. And this is where a second interpretive position enters the picture, one held by many Native scholars and supported by significant portions of the documentary record. This position does not necessarily dispute that some individuals within the system held genuine beliefs about education and assimilation, but argues that individual intentions do not determine what a system actually does. A system is defined by its structure, its consistent methods, and its outcomes. And when the structure, methods, and outcomes of the boarding school system are examined together, The picture that emerges does not fit comfortably inside the framing of misguided but sincere educational policy. Vine Deloria Jr. was a Standing Rock Sioux scholar whose work on Native American history, law, and policy became foundational to the field. He approached the boarding school system and the Dawes Act not as separate policies that happened to overlap in time, but as connected instruments of a broader project. He described them together as a coordinated effort to separate people from both their land and their cultural identity. In his analysis, the school system and the land policy were not two independent programs that coincidentally produced related outcomes. They were two arms of the same effort, operating simultaneously and producing a combined result that neither would have produced alone. Remove the children from the land through the schools. Divide and transfer the land through the Dawes Act. Return the children to communities that no longer have the land base they would have inherited. That sequence, in Deloria's reading, was not accidental. David Wallace Adams, a historian of education who spent years researching the boarding school system, arrived at a similarly severe assessment. He described the entire project using a phrase that has become one of the most cited characterizations of the boarding school era in the scholarly literature. He called it education for extinction. That phrase is precise in a specific way. It does not describe education as merely misguided or culturally insensitive. It describes education as a mechanism deployed toward a specific end, the elimination of indigenous cultural identity as a functioning reality in American life. The word extinction is strong, but Adams chose it based on his reading of the documented record, including the methods used, the outcomes produced, and the stated objectives of the system's designers. His characterization is not universally accepted, but it is grounded in the same documentary record that other historians work from. The tension between these two interpretive positions is not simply a disagreement about tone or emphasis. It is a disagreement about what the historical record actually shows when examined in its full context. The first position focuses on stated intentions and individual cases of beneficial outcome. The second focuses on structural design and aggregate outcomes. Both positions work from documented evidence. Neither is simply invented, and neither has fully persuaded the other side of the scholarly conversation. That persistent disagreement is itself a feature of the historical record that deserves acknowledgement, rather than resolution, through the selection of one position and the dismissal of the other. But this is where it becomes unclear in a way that affects both interpretive positions equally. Both positions have to account for the same documented facts. The schools operated for 150 years across 37 states. More than 400 institutions were built and funded. The methods inside them were consistent enough to suggest central coordination. Children died in documented numbers that the government itself estimates at thousands to tens of thousands. The land held by Native communities dropped from 138 million acres to 48 million acres in roughly 5 decades, while the school system was at its peak. The records that might clarify the relationship between these outcomes are incomplete and in significant part inaccessible. Those facts sit in the record regardless of which interpretive framework is applied to them, and any interpretation that does not account for all of them is working from a partial view of the evidence. The question of intent is one that the available record cannot fully settle. Intent lives in the minds of the people making decisions, and those people are not available to be questioned. What remains is the documentary record they left behind, including official reports, policy documents, correspondence, and the accounts of the people who were inside the schools. Those sources do not speak with a single voice. Pratt's own writings reflect genuine belief in assimilation as a beneficial goal. Senator Teller's 1881 statement reflects a different reading of what the policies were actually designed to accomplish. Luther Standing Bear's accounts reflect the experience of someone inside the system who saw both what it offered and what it took. Vine Deloria's scholarship reflects decades of analysis of the structural outcomes. Each of those sources is part of the record. None of them alone is sufficient to settle the question of what the system was fundamentally for. What the disagreement between interpretive positions reveals is something important about how historical evidence works when the documentation is incomplete. When the full record is available, interpretive disagreements can sometimes be resolved by examining what the documents actually show. When significant portions of the record are inaccessible, As is the case with the boarding school archives held by religious institutions, interpretive disagreements tend to persist because the evidence needed to resolve them is not available. The private archives held by the churches and religious organizations that operated roughly half of all the schools might contain correspondence, policy documents, and administrative records that would clarify the relationship between stated intentions and actual practices inside those institutions. That those archives have not been opened means the interpretive debate continues without the evidence that might settle specific questions within it. Some researchers have suggested that the disagreement between interpretive positions reflects a deeper question about how historical responsibility is assigned. If the boarding school system is understood primarily as the product of sincere but wrong intentions, the responsibility it generates is primarily moral and historical. An era made mistakes. Those mistakes caused harm. The appropriate response is acknowledgement and perhaps apology. If the system is understood as structurally designed to produce the outcomes it produced, the responsibility it generates is more specific. It points toward identifiable policy choices, identifiable institutional decisions, and identifiable beneficiaries of the land transfer and cultural disruption that the system enabled. Those two frames of responsibility point toward different conclusions about what acknowledgement, remedy, and accountability should look like. A sitting president issued a formal apology for the boarding school system in October 2024. That apology used strong language. It acknowledged real harm, and it was, in the judgment of many observers, an important and long overdue act of official recognition. But an apology without a framework for remedy leaves the interpretive question partially open. An apology that treats the system as primarily a product of wrong intentions implies a different set of obligations than an acknowledgement that treats it as a structurally designed program producing specific economic and cultural outcomes. Which framing the apology was built on, and which framing should govern what comes next, is a question that the apology itself did not fully resolve. What both interpretive positions share, and this is the point that matters most for understanding where the historical conversation currently stands, is an acknowledgement that the documented facts exist and must be accounted for. The schools operated. That is confirmed. The children died in documented numbers. That is confirmed. The land transferred in documented quantities over documented decades. That is confirmed. The records are incomplete, and significant portions remain inaccessible. That is confirmed. Every interpretation of this history, regardless of which position it takes on intent or responsibility, has to begin from those same confirmed facts. And any interpretation that produces a conclusion inconsistent with any one of those facts has a problem with its evidence. The facts are not in dispute. What they mean is, and that disagreement has not been resolved. In October 2024, something happened that had not happened in the 145 years since Carlisle opened its doors. A sitting president of the United States traveled to tribal land in Arizona and stood before members of the Gila River Indian community. He spoke words that no president had officially spoken before. He formally apologized on behalf of the United States government for what the boarding school system had done to Native American children, families, and communities across more than a century of operation. He called it a sin on the nation's soul. He called it a blot on American history. Those were his words, delivered on tribal land, in front of witnesses, as an official act of the presidency. The moment was documented. It was broadcast. It entered the public record. And it raised a question that the moment itself did not answer. What does an apology mean when the conditions it is responding to have not yet been resolved? The significance of that apology should not be minimized. Official acknowledgement matters. When a government formally recognizes that a program it administered caused serious harm, that recognition changes the public record in a meaningful way. It creates a documented statement of responsibility that did not previously exist at the presidential level. For communities that had spent generations asking for their history to be acknowledged, for families that had been told for decades that what happened to their relatives was an unfortunate but understandable product of its time, the words spoken in Arizona in October 2024 carried real weight. That should be acknowledged before anything else about the apology is examined. The words were necessary. They were overdue. And they were real. But this is where the examination cannot stop. Because an apology is also a starting point. It marks the moment when official acknowledgement becomes official record, and once that acknowledgement exists, the gap between what has been acknowledged and what has actually been done becomes visible in a way it was not before. The apology named the harm. It did not come with a framework for addressing it, and the specific things that families and researchers have identified as necessary for any meaningful resolution of this history were not announced alongside the words spoken on tribal land. The apology arrived. The framework did not. Consider the question of remains. The government has confirmed at least 74 burial sites at 65 different school locations across the country. More than 800 children are still in the ground at or near the schools where they were sent. That number, 800, is itself a documented minimum. The government has stated that it expects to find more burial sites as its investigation continues. Families who know that a relative attended a boarding school and never returned have, in some cases, spent decades trying to locate where their ancestor is buried and to bring those remains home. The process of identifying, locating, and returning remains is enormously complex. It requires access to records, cooperation between multiple institutions, funding for physical excavation and analysis, and a legal framework governing the process. As of the apology in October 2024, no specific timeline had been announced for completing that process. No funded framework had been established. The remains are confirmed. The path to returning them is not. The records question follows a similar pattern. Throughout this investigation, the inaccessibility of boarding school records has appeared repeatedly as a structural problem. Families searching for ancestors who attended the schools encounter gaps, name changes without cross-references, incomplete death records, and administrative files that exist somewhere in the system but cannot be located or accessed through standard research processes. The government reviewed 103 million pages of its own records during its investigation, but that review was conducted for the purpose of producing a report. It did not automatically translate into those records becoming accessible to families conducting their own research. The gap between records that a government agency can access for an official investigation and records that a family member can access for genealogical research is significant, and that gap has not been closed. The private archives held by religious institutions add a further layer to the records problem. Roughly half of all the schools in the boarding school system were operated by churches and religious organizations. Those institutions administered the schools, employed the staff, made decisions about individual children, and generated administrative records across decades of operation. Those records are not subject to federal disclosure requirements. They are private institutional archives. Some religious organizations have voluntarily begun reviewing their own historical records and sharing findings publicly. That voluntary effort exists and deserves acknowledgement. But voluntary disclosure is selected disclosure. What an institution chooses to share publicly may not reflect the full content of what its archives contain. A formal process requiring the disclosure of records relevant to the boarding school system, applicable to all institutions that received federal funding to operate those schools, has not been established. The apology did not create one. This is where it becomes unclear in a way that the apology itself does not address. If the United States government has formally acknowledged that the boarding school system caused serious harm, the logical next question is what obligations that acknowledgement creates. The acknowledgement of harm in other historical contexts has typically been accompanied by some combination of material remedy, institutional reform, and formal processes for addressing the ongoing consequences of that harm. The apology for the boarding school system was not accompanied by any of those elements in a formal or funded way. It was accompanied by words, and words, however necessary and significant, do not return remains, open archives, or repair genealogical walls that have been standing for 150 years. The genealogical walls are a specific and practical consequence of this history that deserves examination on its own terms. Native American genealogical research runs into a consistent barrier at the boarding school era. Children were renamed, but the original names were not always cross-referenced in surviving records. Children from different tribal communities were placed together in schools far from their home territories, making geographic searches difficult. Death records, where they exist, sometimes list only the English name assigned at the school rather than the name the child arrived with. The records held by religious institutions, which might contain original intake documentation and family correspondence, are not accessible. The result is that millions of Americans with Native ancestry encounter a specific wall in their family research at precisely the period of history that most directly affected their ancestors. That wall is not a natural feature of historical documentation. It was built by the structure of the boarding school system itself, and it has been maintained by the continued inaccessibility of the relevant records. The apology did not announce a funded initiative to address that wall. No formal partnership between federal agencies, tribal nations, and research institutions was announced with the goal of making records accessible to families. No timeline was given for completing the identification of burial sites. No process was created for requiring religious institutions to open their archives to researchers and families. Those specific gaps between the apology and the conditions on the ground are documented. They are not invented criticisms. They reflect the actual state of what exists and what does not exist in the period following the October 2024 acknowledgement. Some observers have argued that the apology itself represented the limit of what was politically achievable at that moment. Presidential apologies do not automatically translate into legislation or funded programs. The process of creating reparations frameworks, establishing mandatory disclosure requirements, and funding the complex work of identifying and returning remains requires congressional action and sustained institutional commitment across multiple administrations. A presidential statement, however significant, cannot by itself produce those outcomes. That observation is fair. The limitations of what a single presidential act can accomplish are real, but those limitations do not change the fact that the gap between the apology and the unresolved conditions exists. They simply explain some of the reasons for it. And this is where the question that opened this entire investigation returns in its simplest form. What kind of school builds a cemetery? That question was posed at the beginning because it captures something specific about this history that is difficult to explain away. A cemetery is not a standard feature of an educational institution. It is not something that appears by accident or emerges from poor planning in an isolated case. The government has confirmed at least 74 burial sites at 65 different school locations and expects to find more. Burial infrastructure built into the physical campuses of institutions spread across 37 states is a structural feature of a system, not a series of local accidents. The question of what kind of school builds a cemetery has a factual answer. The kind of school that anticipates burying the children who arrive inside it in numbers significant enough to require dedicated burial space. That answer does not resolve the question of intent, but it does describe a documented reality. The Army War College now sits on the grounds where Carlisle once operated. The buildings that house the school have been repurposed. The administrative history of the institution has been incorporated into the broader history of the military campus. People who work and study on those grounds today move through the same physical space where children lived, were renamed, were forbidden from speaking their languages, and in some cases were buried. The overlap between the current use of the campus and its historical use is not hidden. It is simply not prominently featured in the everyday experience of the people who occupy the space now. That is a common pattern with historical sites. The present use overlays the past use without erasing it, but the past use is still there in the records, in the confirmed burial sites, and in the ongoing searches by families trying to bring their relatives home. The question of what comes after an apology is one that the historical record of similar acknowledgments in other contexts can inform, but not answer for this specific situation. Different countries have handled formal acknowledgments of historical harm in different ways. Some have established truth and reconciliation commissions. Some have created funded reparations programs. Some have established mandatory disclosure requirements for institutions holding relevant records. Some have done combinations of those things. Each approach reflects specific political, legal, and cultural conditions. The appropriate framework for addressing the ongoing consequences of the American boarding school system is something that Native communities, scholars, legal experts, and policymakers are actively debating. That debate is ongoing. It does not have a settled conclusion, and the apology of October 2024, whatever its significance as a moment of official acknowledgement, did not resolve it. What the current state of this history shows, when examined against the question that started this investigation, is a specific kind of incompleteness. The record exists. The government confirmed it by reviewing 103 million pages of its own documents. The graves exist. The government confirmed at least 74 burial sites and expects to find more. The locked archives exist. The religious institutions that operated half the schools have not been required to open them. The genealogical walls exist. Families searching for ancestors encounter them consistently across the boarding school era. And the apology exists. It is in the public record, spoken on tribal land, using words that named the harm. What does not yet exist is a complete accounting, a full and accessible record, a funded and structured process for returning remains, a mandatory framework for opening private archives, a resolved answer to the question of what the system was fundamentally designed to do and who bears responsibility for what it produced. After 150 years, those things remain unresolved. The apology named the problem. The problem has not been solved by the naming of it. The records are still incomplete. The archives are still locked. The graves are still waiting. The families are still searching. And the question that opened this video, simple enough to ask in a single sentence, complex enough to have remained unanswered for a century and a half, is still open. What kind of school builds a cemetery? The record says it happened. The record says it happened at scale, across hundreds of institutions, in dozens of states, over generations. And the explanation that accounts for all of it completely, that closes every open question in the documented record, that satisfies every piece of evidence the history has produced, has not yet arrived. It may still be waiting in the archives that have not been opened.